Horrifying nightmare. Today, Max watched the news reporting on the tragic death of Mary, a 17-year-old girl who was found near a forest, a case still unsolved. The details passed by, but his focus was elsewhere until the words police investigation and prime suspect sent a shiver down Max's spine. Max turned off the TV, tears streamed down his face, his hands trembling. He felt exhausted, having been sleepless for many days. The weight of it was crushing him constantly. Max knew he was on the verge of breaking down. Suddenly, a message from Dr. Finn arrived, perhaps offering a glimmer of hope for Max, maybe even his last chance to escape the nightmare. Max arrived and saw that it was an old clinic, leaving him somewhat disappointed. The building had no sign, its brick exterior worn by time. No sign, no patients. It was strange, but he was too tired to care. Max knocked, and the door creaked open. Dr. Finn spoke, asking about his condition, but Max's mind couldn't focus due to exhaustion. He explained his insomnia, how the sleepless nights had ruined him, and how much he needed help. Dr. Finn handed him a bottle of unmarked pills, just a clear container. He assured Max they had worked for others and pointed to an old photo on the wall, as if to prove it. That night, Max went to bed, and sleep came easily. Perhaps for the first time in weeks, he felt almost alive again. Until it happened. Max woke up, unable to move. His chest felt heavy, as if something was pressing down on him, suffocating him. Max's eyes darted around the dark room, and then he saw it, a shadow hovering on the ceiling. Max froze, paralyzed. The shadow moved closer, closer until it was right above him. Its eyes stared at Max, mouth wide, letting out horrifying laughter. Suddenly, it lunged at him, merging into Max's body. He could feel every bone tightening around his hands. Max's limbs went cold as if they no longer belonged to him. He struggled, trying to push it out, but it wouldn't leave. A scream pierced through the darkness. Max woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath, his body trembling. The weight finally lifted, but the fear remained. Max couldn't escape this. Max couldn't reach the doctor. Texts and calls went unanswered. Panic started to rise in Max's chest. As Max stared at the white pill bottle on the table, he knew he shouldn't take more, but he needed it. He needed to sleep. Max felt like he would die without it. The next night, the paralysis returned. This time, it was worse. Max felt the shadow pressing down on him, heavier than before. He couldn't breathe. Max could hear ragged breathing in his ear, a sound like someone struggling to take a breath. A thick liquid was dripping onto Max's face. He couldn't wipe it away. The shadow became clearer. Now it was a girl. Her dress torn and caked with dirt, her mouth gaping open, and her head hung down, her disheveled hair brushing against Max's face. Max knew her. It was Mary. She stared at him, her lifeless eyes wide with anger. Her fingers tightened their grip on him, and she spoke in a raspy voice. "Give it back to me. Give me my life back." Max woke up again, sitting up, gasping for breath. He needed those pills, now more than ever. His hands trembled as he opened the bottle, swallowing handfuls of the small white pills. For a moment, Max felt relief. Then the pain hit. His veins felt like they were about to erupt like a volcano. Max clawed at his neck in desperation, but nothing could stop it. His throat burned. Max collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing. His vision blurred as foam slowly bubbled from his mouth. Max itched uncontrollably, unable to stop the wave of sensations. Max lay motionless, his eyes wide, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Everything faded to black. After Max left, the police arrived at the scene and discovered his car, left unused in the garage for days. Inside, they found a shovel and a blood-stained glove. Upon investigation, they matched the blood to Mary. Max was the killer. The two of them didn't know each other. Max had caused a car accident in a desolate forest, and in a panic, he buried her body, using chemicals to erase his fingerprints, making the investigation increasingly difficult. The news that day announced that the authorities had identified Mary's killer and described the brutality of Max's actions towards her. Police also uncovered that Max was mentally disturbed and had overdosed on sedatives in a state of delusion. The school's isolation room. It was 3 years ago that I had a memorable experience in my life. I am a musician and a member of my school's music club. I was often invited to participate in performances at music camps and workshops. That year, I was invited by a school in the suburbs. At the beginning, I felt very happy and excited to be surrounded by friends who shared the same interests and passions as me. As the bus rolled into the town, I noticed the place was quite lively, but that pleasant feeling didn't last long. Within minutes, the bustling noise disappeared. I looked out the window and realized we were entering a dense forest. All I could see were countless trees, and it seemed very quiet. Finally, after a few hours, we arrived. The school appeared before us, and it looked quite mysterious. The students here seemed somewhat unusual. They wore their uniforms neatly and strictly, though the fashion was a bit outdated, like from a decade ago, but their expressions were like they were soulless. They glanced at us with cold eyes whenever we passed by. We had separate rooms, and I went to mine. In my room, there were 3 girls staying together. The room looked rather bare and had little light coming in. Strangely, while we were in the hallway, they kept staring at us in a strange way. That night, after a long day, I returned to my room. I'm not good at sleeping in unfamiliar places, and this place was no exception. I tossed and turned for hours, feeling uneasy and uncomfortable. At around 2:30 a.m., I heard slow, soft footsteps. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. Too scared, I pulled the blanket over myself and tried to sleep. The next morning, while we were packing up, I casually asked, "Did anyone else hear footsteps last night?" May, one of my friends, burst out laughing, saying that it was probably just our imagination. But then, Lee suddenly started trembling and asked me,
"You heard it too?"
We all froze. A strange silence filled the room as we realized that we had all heard the same sound. Throughout the day, I struggled to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to those footsteps. By the evening, my fear had grown. I just wanted to go home. That night, the atmosphere in the room felt even heavier. None of us could relax, let alone sleep. Hours passed, but we remained wide awake. Lee eventually fell asleep. May and I stayed up, whispering to each other to distract ourselves. It was just after 2:30 a.m. when the footsteps started again. This time, they were louder, clearer. I broke out in a cold sweat, and goosebumps covered my skin. The footsteps grew closer. Both of us pulled the blankets over our heads, trembling, hoping that whatever it was would leave us alone. Then, I felt it, a light touch on my arm. My breath caught in my throat from the chilling sensation. I trembled, feeling someone standing beside me. I have no idea how long we stayed like that. It was truly a nightmare. The final day at the school seemed to drag on, exhaustion and fear weighing on us. We were drained. As we boarded the bus, the students still stared at us, just like when we first arrived, for no apparent reason. It felt as though they knew something we didn't. On the way home, May fell ill. The bus driver glanced at us through the rearview mirror and said something I will never forget.
I can't believe you actually stayed overnight in that school.
Later, we searched for information about the school and found forums where people were discussing it. It turned out that the room we stayed in was called the isolation room. We also discovered that 2 years before we arrived, 3 students at the school had died there due to the pressures of life, studies, or something else. That's why it was called the isolation room, to keep people away from it. I don't know if anyone else besides the 3 of us has gone through this terrible experience. Did they hear the footsteps, feel the cold breaths on their necks like we did? I'll never know. But what I do know is that those 3 days were the most terrifying of my life. Strange woman on the roadside. I had just recently moved to the suburbs. This story is something I will never forget, a terrifying encounter that still haunts me. It was a regular evening around 6 p.m., and the streets were busy as usual. I had just finished my training classes and felt very tired. Since my home was about 1 to 2 hours away by bus, the thought of waiting and being crowded on the bus seemed unbearable. So, I decided to take a taxi home. The taxi ride started off smoothly, but as we neared my neighborhood, the car suddenly stopped and wouldn't start. My driver couldn't get it running again. The sky was getting darker. My house was still a few kilometers away, so I decided to walk the rest of the way since it was getting too late to wait. As I walked along the dark, empty road, after a few minutes, I noticed something. There was a figure crouching behind a bush near the sidewalk. It was a girl, about my age. She looked distressed and in need of help. The wind picked up, blowing her long black hair across her face. I slowed down, squinting to make sure my tiredness wasn't deceiving me. Her body seemed to blend into the darkness, her head bowed low, and her frail shoulders shaking as if she were sobbing. I cautiously approached her and asked if she needed help. For a moment, she didn't respond, but the girl slowly lifted her head, her voice barely a whisper as she said,
Thank you for your concern. I hurt my leg while walking.
She lifted her dress, revealing a swollen, blood-streaked ankle, and continued,
Could you give me your handkerchief?
I hesitated for a moment, then asked if she had told her family. She nodded, saying they were on their way, but her injury was very painful and needed bandaging quickly. Her lips twitched, curling into an eerie, strange smile. She whispered that she really needed it. I stepped back, sensing something was wrong, my hand frozen in my pocket. Just as I was about to hand her the handkerchief, a sudden movement appeared. An old man was walking down the sidewalk. He moved urgently, as if something important needed attention, his wrinkled face lined with worry and tension. Without a word, he suddenly grabbed my arm and said,
Hey kid, who are you talking to?
Confused, I pointed behind me, where the girl was sitting and needed help. His face turned pale, his eyes wide with horror as he told me there was no one there, and that I needed to leave immediately. I turned back to the bush, but she was no longer sitting there. She was standing, taller now, and it looked like she was hovering above the ground. She was staring straight at me, demanding that I give her what she asked for. The old man tugged my arm harder.
Don't give her anything. She's not human. She's the spirit of a girl who died 26 years ago.
His words snapped me back to reality. Her lips stretched into an unnaturally wide grin, her face distorted, aging, hollow and cracked. My legs moved instinctively. I bolted, running as fast as I could, with the old man right behind me. I didn't dare look back. She was laughing, and I could feel her ghostly presence hovering just behind me. I ran until I couldn't breathe, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. I pounded on the door, my hands trembling, calling for my mother. She opened the door, confused, looking past me towards the dark road, and asked,
Who was that girl?
I went pale, frozen in place. I told my mother that there was no girl. I didn't care about anything anymore. I staggered inside and slammed the door shut because I believed what the old man had said. I went to my room, but then a horrifying thought flashed in my mind. If my mother had seen her too, did that mean she had followed me home? My mother knocked on the door, asking if I was okay. For a moment, I considered letting my mother in and telling her everything. But what if the girl was still there? What if opening the door also let her in? Panic overtook me, so I quickly told my mother I was fine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the window seemed like her, like she was there, watching, waiting for me to drop my guard. That night, the old man had saved me. I still don't know what would have happened if I had given her my handkerchief. I reassured myself that as long as I kept the handkerchief safe, I would be fine. The strange reunion. My trip to the high school reunion was supposed to be uneventful, just a simple journey through familiar territory, but it turned out to be unsettling. I flew to the nearest airport, rented a car, and set off, with the GPS guiding me through rural roads I hadn't seen in years. The landscape was desolate, with dense forests. I couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. It was as if the whole world had forgotten this place. After about 3 miles of this, I saw someone standing by the side of the road. Next to him was a car with the trunk open. It was an old, beat-up vehicle. I'd never stopped for strangers on desolate roads, but this time, my heart skipped a beat. I recognized the man. It was Jay. I pulled over and rolled down the window, but before I could say anything, he was at the door, gripping the handle. He was panting and got into the passenger seat without hesitation. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if being chased or watched. I asked him what was going on, but his responses were disjointed, almost nonsensical. He stammered, muttering about the woods. I couldn't understand him, and it made me uneasy and afraid. He started hearing something from the woods. He reached out, grabbed the steering wheel, and yelled at me, "Just drive." I didn't hesitate. I slammed my foot on the gas. We reached the reunion, held at the old high school basketball court. I parked and got out, but he lingered for a moment, his eyes still darting around. Inside, the atmosphere was completely different. People were laughing, reminiscing about old times. The normalcy of the scene made me feel disoriented after what had just happened on the road. Jay said he needed to use the bathroom and disappeared without another word. I tried to shake off the lingering fear and grabbed a drink, hoping to calm my nerves. Just then, I saw Gary, another old classmate, approaching me. He looked pale, his eyes wide with shock. Before I could ask what was wrong, he grabbed my arm and blurted out that Jay was dead. They found his body by a riverbank. I felt the glass slip from my hand, shattering on the floor. My heart stopped. That couldn't be true. I had just driven Jay here. He was at the party with me. But Gary didn't stop. He went on to explain how Jay's car was found by the side of the road, the trunk open. The police said he had been lured into the woods, ambushed by his attacker. I didn't wait to hear more. I rushed to the bathroom, my mind spinning. Something had to be wrong. He had been with me. The bathroom was empty, eerily silent. My footsteps echoed on the tiled floor. I called out for Jay, but there was no answer. Then, something caught my attention. In the mirror on the wall beside me, I saw his reflection. I could see his face in the reflection, standing there, grinning at me with a sinister smile. Then it all faded away, like it dissolved into the air. I stumbled back, collapsing to the floor, my heart pounding, my head spinning. Who was the person I met on the road? Could it have been Ben, not Jay? The days following the reunion passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about Jay and what had happened, as well as what I had seen. Then, a week later, the police found the person responsible for Jay's death, but that person was gone too. I didn't want to believe it, but could it have been Jay's spirit? Or was it the person who hurt him? Thousands of questions, and not a single answer. Pizza orders at the end of the day. If you've ever worked the late shift at a delivery restaurant, then you're probably familiar with occasionally receiving a last-minute order just before closing. That day, a man placed an order for a pizza. After entering the location into the GPS, I realized that the address was far and remote. I tried to mention the inconvenience of delivering it because it was quite far, but the guy on the phone just ignored me. As I entered the address into the GPS on my phone, I realized how remote it was, and I started regretting not hanging up when I had the chance. As I drove, the winding, unfamiliar roads led me deeper into the countryside, past an old abandoned blockbuster. I recalled my mother's warning never to go beyond that place, but I never knew why. Memories of missing children and locked doors from years ago flooded back, leaving me uneasy. The dirt roads became increasingly difficult to navigate. Finally, I arrived at the location, a rundown, abandoned house at the end of a muddy road. I felt a chill as I wondered if I had the right address, but the GPS confirmed that I had arrived. Leaving the pizza in the car, I approached the house to see if anyone was home. A note was taped to the door with instructions to deliver the pizza to a vehicle near the house. This struck me as odd. Why hadn't the customer mentioned this over the phone? And who asks for a pizza to be delivered to a vehicle? I was confused. Despite growing anxiety, I decided to follow the instructions since I had come this far. As I rounded the corner of the house, I was startled to see an old camper van parked with its back doors wide open. I slowly approached, hardly daring to breathe. I froze as I realized the figure was dragging something heavy, a rolled-up carpet, stained dark. The man finally moved, stepping forward into the dim light. His face remained hidden in the shadows by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel the cold and mysterious aura emanating from him. He extended a gloved hand toward me, but instead of reaching for the pizzas, he handed me an old, weathered envelope. I hesitated before taking it, sensing something unsettling. His voice was low and ominous as he told me to take the envelope to the house on the hill, a place I knew was infamous in local lore, said to be cursed. Before I could refuse, the man turned and walked back into the vehicle, disappearing into the darkness. I was left alone in the cold night, holding the envelope. I quickly turned and rushed back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I fumbled with the keys, desperate to start the engine and get away. I didn't dare open the envelope, fearing what might be inside. Instead, I threw it onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove off. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, praying no one was following me. Then suddenly, that vehicle began chasing me, with the faint sound of the radio echoing behind. In a moment of desperation, I decided to floor the gas pedal and head back to the old blockbuster building, the only nearby place where I might find some cover. I pulled off the road and parked behind the building, killing the engine. I held my breath, praying I hadn't been seen. I waited until the music faded before I dared to breathe again. As I sat in the darkness, my phone finally died, plunging me into complete isolation. In the distance, I saw a figure. It was him, slowly approaching with that mysterious wide-brimmed hat. Panic began to overtake me. I fumbled to start the car, my hands trembling with fear. The engine roared to life just as the man reached the car, his hands slamming against the window. I slammed the gas pedal, and sped away from there. I drove straight to the police station. When I arrived, I frantically explained what had happened, but the officers seemed skeptical. They told me that the house where I delivered the order had been abandoned for years and that the area was known for strange occurrences, but I knew what I had seen. Several weeks later, as I tried to move on with my life, I received a package in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was the same old envelope, and this time there was something inside a small handwritten note that simply read, "We will meet again." The Haunting of Jefferson High. Jefferson High School was an old building with a rich history. It had been around for over a century, with stories of hauntings passed down from generation to generation. As a senior, I never believed the tales until the night I decided to stay late to finish a project. It was a stormy evening, the perfect setting for a horror story. The rain pounded against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The school was eerily silent, with only the occasional creak of the old wooden floors breaking the stillness. My friend Emily had promised to stay with me, but she bailed at the last minute, leaving me alone in the dimly lit library. I was deep into my research when I heard it, a faint whisper. I looked up, scanning the rows of bookshelves, but saw nothing. Shaking it off as my imagination, I continued working. The whisper came again, louder this time, and I could make out words.
Help me.
My heart raced as I stood up, the sound seemingly coming from the far corner of the library. Clutching my phone for light, I walked towards the sound. As I neared the corner, the air grew colder, and the whispering grew more desperate. I turned the corner and saw an old, dusty book lying on the floor. The whispering stopped. "Oh." Hesitantly, I picked up the book and opened it. Inside, there were handwritten notes dating back decades, detailing the mysterious disappearance of a student named Sarah Mitchell in 1953. According to the notes, Sarah had stayed late one night to finish a project, just like me. She was last seen in the library, and rumors had it that her spirit never left. Chills ran down my spine as I read about strange occurrences reported by students over the years, books flying off shelves, cold spots, and whispers for help. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. I turned around to leave. The library door slammed shut on its own. Panic set in as I rushed to the door, pulling with all my might, but it wouldn't budge. My phone's light flickered, and in the dim glow, I saw her. A translucent figure of a girl standing by the window, her eyes filled with sorrow.
Help me.
She whispered again, her voice echoing in the empty room. I froze, unable to move or speak. Sarah's ghost floated closer, her hand reaching out to me. In a flash, images flooded my mind. Her being locked in the library, crying for help, and eventually succumbing to despair. Summoning all my courage, I asked, "How can I help you?" Grabbing a pen, I wrote down her final words as she dictated them to me. She spoke of feeling trapped, alone, and scared, and how she longed for someone to find her. As I finished writing, the room grew warmer, and the oppressive feeling lifted. Sarah's ghost smiled faintly before fading away, leaving me alone in the now silent library. The door creaked open, and I knew she was finally at peace. The next day, I reported the incident to the school authorities, who were skeptical but intrigued. They placed the book in a display case in the library, honoring Sarah's memory. Jefferson High was still old and creaky, but from that day on, the whispers for help ceased, and Sarah Mitchell's spirit was finally free.